Bienvenue à la réunion.
Welcome to meeting number 23 of the Standing Committee on Fisheries and Oceans.
Acknowledging that we are gathered on the ancestral and unceded territories of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people, and express gratitude that we're able to do the important work of this committee on lands that they've stewarded since time immemorial. But I would also like to acknowledge the 2026 Super Bowl champion Seattle Seahawks.
Whoa, few of us.
And a great season played. But pursuant to Standing Order 1082, the committee is meeting to continue its study on marine and coastal protections. Et la réunion d'aujourd'hui se déroule.
Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the standing orders. Members can attend in person in the room or remotely using the Zoom application.
I would like to ask all in-person participants to consult the guidelines written on the cards on the table. These measures are in place to help prevent audio and feedback incidents and to protect the health and safety of all participants, but particularly the interpreters. And you'll also notice a QR code on the card which links to a short awareness video. Pursuant to our routine motions, I would like to advise the committee members that all witnesses appearing virtually today have successfully conducted the required technical testing. And I would like to make a few comments for the benefits of the witnesses and members. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. And for those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you're not speaking. Et en ce qui concerne l'interprète.
As regards interpretation, if you're on Zoom, at the bottom of your screen, you can select the appropriate channel for interpretation, floor, English or French. If you're in the room, you can use the earpiece and select your preferred language channel.
Comments should be addressed through the chair. Et pour les députés présents dans la salle, si
For members in the room, please raise your hand if you wish to speak, and for MPs on Zoom, please use the raise hand function.
I'd like to welcome our witnesses. We have Professor Anna Metaxas from Dalhousie University participating by video conference. We have in person here today Kendra McDonald, Chief Executive Officer of Canada's Ocean Supercluster, and participating by video conference we have Dwan Street, President, Fish, Food, and Allied Workers, Unifor. So we're going to start with witnesses' opening statements for 5 minutes or less, starting with Professor Metaxas.
Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. Mr. Chair and members of the committee, I wish to firstly thank you for this invitation as a witness for your study on marine and coastal protections. I have been conducting research relating to the design of marine protected areas for more than 20 years. Within the Canadian context, in particular the Maritimes, my research group provided data that led to the closures of the Eastern Jordan Basin and Corsair and Georgia Canyons as sensitive benthic areas, and now as OECMs. We have been providing scientific data, helping with monitoring, and contributing to the ecological overviews for the Eastern Shore Islands AOI and Fandian Channel Browns Bank AOI. I regularly provide science advice to DFO, including as a member of the advisory committees for the endeavor of Hot Fence Marine Protected Area, the Eastern Shore Islands AOI, the Fandian Channel Browns Bank AOI, as well as the Conservation Network Technical Working Group and the Marine Refugee Coordinating Committee in the Maritimes specifically. Internationally, I have participated in several meetings of the Convention on Biological Diversity, including for 3 of which as a member of the Canadian delegation. Lastly, I'm currently a coordinating lead author on the chapter of implementing Targets 2 and 3, appropriately, of the KMGBF for the Spatial Planning and Connectivity Assessment of IPES, also being nominated by Canada. In all these activities, I act as an honest broker. I will be happy to share my experiences with these processes during the question period. To answer your questions briefly, the Government of Canada has signed international agreements to halt biodiversity loss and has developed a national plan to conserve biodiversity across Canada's 3 oceans. The science is unequivocal. Protecting biodiversity can help maintain healthy oceans, support our coastlines against erosion, provide nurseries for ecologically and commercially important species, including birds, enhance carbon sequestration, as well as directly contribute to human health. Biodiversity loss can result from many stressors, such as resource extraction, climate change, habitat loss through coastal development, pollution, eutrophication, as well as fishing, among others. Importantly, the impacts of these stressors are not isolated but cumulatively. For example, polluted ecosystems are more vulnerable to ocean warming. Or, when seagrass beds are lost, the carbon they store is released back into the atmosphere. One tool to protect biodiversity is marine conservation areas, which play the same role as our national parks on land. Conservation objectives are typically specific to an MCA and about conservation of biodiversity and not about managing fisheries. The process of implementing networks of Oceans Act MPAs in Canada started with the Endeavour Hot Fence back in 2003, followed by the Galley in 2004. At that time and into the early 2010s, the process would take an average a decade to complete, as for example with St. Anne's Bank. As of March 2025, approximately 15.5% of Canada marine and coastal areas were designated in some form of conservation measure, which include Oceans Act MPAs, national parks with marine components, bird sanctuaries, etc. In terms of timing, of the 14 Oceans Act MPAs specifically, 6 were designated before 2015, and for another 5, the process towards designation also was initiated before 2015. But we still have quite a bit of work to do. And because this is very much an ongoing process, it is still too early to fully address your specific questions at this point. I would like to reinforce the point of many previous witnesses. For implementation of MCAs to be successful, broad and deep consultations with as many stakeholders and rights holders as possible are critical from the onset of the design process and for the duration of the lifetime of an MCA. I firmly believe that marine conservation can, in fact should, coexist with other ocean uses, including fisheries, but also aquaculture, shipping, or tourism, in the same way as our national parks coexist with agriculture and other activities. However, spatial planning used to allocate space to different activities on land and in the sea, including marine conservation, requires trade-offs by all actors. Thus, lack of adequate consultation often leads to misinformation and failure to reach a compromise that everybody can live with. Importantly, long-standing mistrust of government that dates back decades and across governments of all colors can and has derailed the process, an example being the Eastern Shore Islands AOI, for which I will be happy to provide more detail. So can province-specific priorities that may not align with federal ones. To understand whether targets are met and objectives achieved take time, possibly decades for some MCAs, and requires monitoring.
Professor, I'm afraid we're out of time. I'm just going to ask you to please wrap up, and then we're going to have to move on.
I'm on my last paragraph. And requires monitoring of environmental conditions, ecological states, socioeconomic impacts, enforcement, and management effectiveness. The system of MCA is still evolving in Canada, providing an opportunity to keep improving their implementation. For example, the Banque des Américains MPA was just recognized as exemplary and was nominated for a global award as a Blue Park. This indicates that we can get it right. However, I believe that to get it right, we need to sustain the allocation of human and financial resources to the process to ensure extensive consultations, detailed socioeconomic analysis, and robust monitoring. Thank you. I'll be happy to answer your specific questions.
Thank you very much, Professor. Next, we're going to go to Kendra McDonald for 5 minutes or less.
Chair and members of the committee, merci beaucoup pour l'opportunité d'être.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here today.
As the CEO of Canada's Ocean Supercluster, which is a national innovation cluster that brings together almost 1,000 members across industry, Indigenous partners, researchers, and government in Canada to help translate complex ocean challenges into practical, deployable solutions. With over 150 projects in our portfolio, our role is not to set policy, but to ensure that policy ambition is supported by real-world capability. From that perspective, I'd like to focus on a Canadian but also what is a global challenge. As marine protected areas expand globally, including here in Canada, governments are encountering a common problem. Monitoring, enforcement, and impact measurement have not kept pace with MPA designation. In many jurisdictions, MPAs are monitored through periodic surveys, infrequent patrols, and data sets that sit in different institutions for different purposes. Even where intentions are strong, this does make it difficult to answer basic questions on an ongoing basis, like what is happening in the water, how ecosystems are responding, and how fisheries and other activities are interacting with protected areas over time. This is a global challenge, and in Canada, that challenge is shaped by a siloed reality. We do not have a national marine spatial plan, a dedicated plan on the use of our marine space, or a comprehensive blue economy strategy that provides a shared integrated view of how conservation, fisheries, shipping, energy, coastal communities, and other ocean uses are meant to coexist over time. As a result, decisions are often made by sector, by program, or by region, rather within a unified spatial and economic context. This means that decisions on trade-offs are assessed case by case, rather than being supported by a more cumulative view. However, Canada does have significant data to support decision-making. We have fisheries science, compliance data, environmental monitoring, oceanographic information, and Indigenous and community-based observations. But this often exists in pockets. It's designed for specific purposes and not consistently integrated to show how decisions across marine activities interact. Without that integration, it becomes harder to demonstrate, for example, how protected areas support fisheries or climate resilience, or where adaptive changes are warranted as climate impacts change conditions over time. This is where technology becomes essential. Technology allows monitoring to move from episodic observation to ongoing assessment. It allows enforcement to be informed by data rather than visibility alone. And it makes it possible to connect ecological, operational, and economic information in ways that support evidence-based discussion. Importantly, technology does not replace Indigenous knowledge, local expertise, or governance. It complements them by improving visibility, consistency, and shared understanding. And in many cases, it can reduce cost and increase collaboration. The good news is this capacity already exists in Canada, and I get to see it every day in my role. For example, Canadian-developed systems such as AI-enabled fish monitoring platforms are already being used to observe fish presence and movement continuously using underwater sensors and analytics. These tools are directly applicable to sensitive habitats and protected areas, providing non-intrusive, real-time insights into what is happening below the surface. The same goes for Canadian autonomous and acoustic monitoring platforms that observe marine activity and ecosystem conditions over large areas, supporting situational awareness, more targeted compliance, and the kind of longitudinal data needed to evaluate outcomes over time. Advances in environmental genomics technologies are addressing environmental stewardship and enhancing pathogen detection and mitigation efforts, information that could directly support decision-making around MPAs. These technologies show that the constraint is not whether we can observe the ocean, it is whether we choose to integrate that information into decision-making. Better information does not eliminate disagreement, but it does support evidence-based discussion. I believe Canada can build on its strengths: strong science, capable institutions, innovative technology, and deep Indigenous knowledge so that ocean decisions in any policy direction are grounded in credible, ongoing measurement that shows that those affected by these decisions, whether desired outcomes are being achieved. A healthy ocean is a more productive ocean, and conservation and economic objectives can be aligned and be supported by more integrated data. Using this data to inform a national cohesive marine spatial plan, we can connect MPA monitoring from coast to coast to coast while strengthening an already thriving ocean economy in Canada. Thank you, merci.
Thank you very much, Ms. McDonald. And we're going to now conclude with opening remarks for 5 minutes or less from Ms. Street. Oh, just you're on mute still.
I'll get used to this someday. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the members of the committee for the opportunity to appear before you today. My name is Dwan Street. I am the president of the Fish, Food and Allied Workers Union, FFAW Unifor, and we represent thousands of fish harvesters, processing workers, and coastal residents in Newfoundland and Labrador, whose livelihoods and communities depend directly on continued access to marine resources and the long-term health of the ocean. I appreciate the committee's focus on marine and coastal protections and the opportunity to speak to how these measures have affected fishing communities, how conservation success is being measured, and whether the stated objectives are actually achieved. So let me be clear at the outset, FFAW members support conservation. No one has a greater stake in healthy oceans than fish harvesters. Our members work on the water every day, and they depend on sustainable ecosystems, not only for today's income, but for the long-term survival of their communities. That said, our experience over the past decade shows that while the intent behind marine and coastal protections may be well-meaning, the way these measures have been implemented has had serious and lasting consequences for fishing-dependent communities, while raising legitimate questions about fairness, consistency, and effectiveness. Since 2015, the federal government has significantly expanded marine protected areas and marine refuges. For coastal communities, these decisions are not abstract. They directly determine whether people can continue to make a living from the sea. And when a fishing area is closed, the impact is immediate. But more importantly, it is often permanent. Lost access represents a direct economic loss that extends across generations. Fishing enterprises are built around access to specific grounds. And once that access is removed, it is rarely restored. Over time, closures reduce the viability of owner-operator enterprises, they limit opportunities for young people to enter the fishery, they weaken processing capacity, and contribute to population decline in rural coastal communities. These impacts are compounded by the cumulative effect of multiple closures layered on top of one another, often without a full accounting of long-term socioeconomic consequences. While conservation benefits are frequently framed at a national or global level, the costs are borne locally by fishing-dependent communities with few alternative economic options. FFAW are also deeply concerned about clear imbalances in how different ocean users are treated within marine refuges established in the name of conservation. In several cases, fishing activity is categorically prohibited, even where it may pose little to no risk for conservation objectives. For example, in areas such as the Funk Island Deep, fishing methods like long line fishing, which have minimal contact with the seabed, are not permitted. At the same time, in other areas, including the Northeast Marine Slope Refuge, oil and gas exploration and development activities are allowed to proceed. What is particularly troubling is the process applied to these decisions. Oil and gas proponents are given the opportunity to demonstrate, through various testing and monitoring, that their activities will not cause significant harm to conservation. Fisheries are not given the same opportunity. Fishing activity is simply excluded outright without an equivalent evidence-based assessment or a chance to demonstrate compatibility with conservation goals. From the perspective of fish harvesters, this represents a clear double standard. Industrial activities are permitted subject to conditions, while fishing, a renewable, highly regulated activity that sustains coastal communities, is shut out entirely. This imbalance is compounded by the lack of transparency around how the government measures whether conservation objectives are being achieved once protected areas are established. Monitoring and evaluation are inconsistent, long-term outcomes are often unclear, and results are not always publicly reported. Fishing activity is heavily monitored, controlled, and enforced. It is reasonable to expect the same level of rigor and accountability in demonstrating that marine refuges and protected areas are delivering the environmental benefits that justified their creation. Designation alone does not guarantee conservation success. If objectives are biodiversity protection, habitat conservation, or stock recovery, those outcomes must be clearly demonstrated. Where evidence shows objectives that are not being met, management measures must be reviewed and adapted. Fish harvester knowledge must be central to that process. Our members possess generations of experience and understanding of marine ecosystems. That knowledge should not end at the designation stage. It must be part of ongoing monitoring, evaluation, and decision-making. In closing, marine and coastal protections must be effective, evidence-based, and fair. When fishing access is removed, the economic loss to coastal communities is often permanent and can last for generations. Canadians deserve clear evidence that such sacrifices are producing real environmental benefits. FFAW believes conservation and sustainable fisheries are inseparable goals. Achieving both requires transparency, accountability, adaptive management, and equal treatment of all ocean users. And thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. And that concludes our opening remarks. We're going to go straight into the first round of questioning, starting with Mr. Small for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to welcome our witnesses today. My first question is to Ms. Street. Ms. Street, did the government need to sign on to the United Nations 30 by 30 Marine Protected Areas scheme in order, to protect Canadian waters when more than a dozen acts of Parliament are in place to protect fish stocks and our ocean ecosystems? Was agreeing to 30 by 30 necessary, do you feel?
We don't feel it was necessary. We feel, it was a very extreme target, and unfortunately, it has been the fishing industry that's borne the brunt of what we've seen, our goalposts that are constantly moving. We heard 10, then we heard 15, and that was 20, and that was 30. And our question is, when does it stop? Again, we don't feel like the fishing industry is being treated fairly in this. And had we all gotten to the table, there are pristine areas, say in the Arctic, in northern Labrador, that everybody was willing to work together that could help meet those targets and not affect our industry negatively. But unfortunately, what we're seeing is just a complete, I call it a disrespect for our industry. I mean, we just a little while ago had the Virgin Rocks come across our desk as a potential closure. And our members are up in arms. I mean, it's one of the most lucrative historical fishing grounds when it comes to northern cod, which of course is on the rebound and is becoming much more important to our members as a species that they will harvest.
I want to stop you right there, Ms. Street. When did you find out about the Virgin Rocks Marine Protected Area? Would you have been one of the first groups that would have been approached for your support in the developing of that, since you're such a user that depends on that area so much?
Yeah, we're not quite sure where we were in the hierarchy of folks that were informed, but I do remember our industry liaison, Katie Power, who deals with closed areas on the forefront, coming to me late fall last year and saying, look, I think this is going to be a major issue. And we were absolutely floored when we saw that the Virgin Rocks were even in consideration.
Thank you. So I heard you mention pristine areas that could be protected. And, typically when we look at land-based protected areas, historically, we'd be looking at areas where we had old growth forest or whatnot, and areas that were never touched, that were pristine. Do we have areas in the ocean that are pristine and rarely fished that you think could have a priority to be protected over areas that have been, basically some of these areas have been bottom trawled that the bottom is like a parking lot?
Yeah, I mean, we obviously speak to our Indigenous counterparts on a regular basis as well. And I know there were some areas in northern Labrador that were under consideration, and mostly areas that were never fished, whether by our members or Indigenous groups. And it just seems like those fell by the wayside. Unfortunately, it seems like the target is always on the back of the fishing industry.
Thank you. To Ms. McDonald, so how do you feel about the need for our federal government to sign on to the United Nations 30 by 30 marine protected areas protocol when our oceans are protected by more than a dozen acts of parliament?
So our role is not to comment on the policy. Certainly I've been part of a number of discussions and there is a global focus on protection. But I think that the conversation globally and the challenge is we can't have the designations outpacing our ability to monitor, enforce, and understand impacts.
Thank you. But along the lines of where Ms. Street and I were just speaking, when we look at land-based protected areas and national parks, historically, when we began with national parks, pristine areas and old growth forests and areas that were never touched by any type of developing or resource harvesting were first to be protected. Do you think that's the way that 30 by 30 could proceed in protecting pristine areas that are not touched already?
That would not be my area of expertise.
Okay, thank you. So, Ms. Street, oftentimes Canadian NGOs are pushing the narrative for establishing new protected areas, and they're often funded by American foundations to help sway public opinion in favor of creating these protected areas. How do you feel about that?
Well, we've been very public and very clear on our position when it comes to ENGOs, and we're deeply troubled that the Canadian government has them at the table as stakeholders in fishery management decisions when clearly the only stake they hold is padding their own pockets and their own coffers for their donors. I want to stress again that FFAW members believe in conservation. There are no greater stewards of the resource than fish harvesters. It's their livelihood. It's going to be their livelihood for generations. And it's very easy for somebody in an office who's probably never seen saltwater to weigh in and try to shut down somebody else's livelihood when it really doesn't affect them. It's been troubling since the days of their advocacy against the seal hunt. We've seen the devastation that that's caused. And now we see them trying to shut down fisheries, shut down areas, and just absolutely nothing demonstrated that it's going to achieve any of their goals. So we really do question their motives. And again, as you said, Mr. Small, they're catering to American donors, just millionaires who have no stake in the fishing industry. So it is troubling, and we're seeing their involvement grow, and it's something that we are going to continue to push back on.
Thank you very much, Mr. Small. Next, we're going to go to Mr. Clausen for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all the witnesses for bringing all your information forward. As we have said over and over again in this committee, that conservation and, as Ms. Street said, conservation and a sustainable fishing industry is doable, and that's obviously the goal for all of us here, to ensure that that we protect the waters and that we protect the industry of all the harvesters and the communities. Ms. Street, you were mentioning that the ENGOs were not engaging or not involved in being on the water, and I'm just wondering, how can we ensure that the ENGOs and the harvesters all bring adequate information and reliable information to the table?
Well, we don't feel that there is a role for ENGOs when it comes to the management of fisheries. We've sat at the table, and their messaging is always close it down, stop fishing, limit fishing, and there doesn't seem to be a willingness to work together. And when that messaging is just always negative and trying to put our members out of a livelihood, we don't feel that anything they're bringing to the table is reliable. We don't trust what their motives are. And, our interest is always maintaining that the resource is healthy and it's going to sustain our communities for a long, long time, because in Newfoundland and Labrador, without the fisheries, our communities are just going to die.
Okay, thank you very much. To Professor Metaxas, hope I said that right. We have 196 countries around the world that have signed on to 30 by 30. I'm just curious to know if you could tell us a little bit about where does Canada stand in relation to where some of the other countries, or the majority of the other countries, are in enforcing or achieving 30 by 30. And also, if you could talk a little bit about is Canada following 30 by 30 the process, or are we doing a Canadian version of 30 by 30?
Yeah, thank you very much. And you almost pronounced my name correctly. So first of all, the 196 nations have not just signed to a 30 by 30. That's a sort of a very sort of narrow view. What all those nations have signed on is, as we heard earlier in the week, is to a global biodiversity framework. The purpose of this is to support, to prevent biodiversity loss, right? So that has 4 goals and 23 targets, one of which is 30 by 30. Another target is sustainable fisheries. Another target is, doing something about climate change and minimizing the impacts of climate change. Another target is spatial planning. So that is what Canada has signed on, and 30 by 30 is just one. Now, in terms of how Canada is doing, Canada, I would say, is, as you can expect, doing better than some and worse than others. There are countries, small island states, that rely completely on their oceans because that's what they're surrounded for example, Palau, that have very high protection levels that have way exceeded the 30% already. There are other countries that are much less. And so I would say we're in the middle of the road, as Canada usually is. And in terms of whether we're approaching it with a Canadian reality, I think every country has to do that, and including Canada. We can't just, there is no recipe. Everybody's trying to adjust to the realities.
Thank you for that. You also mentioned about consultation, and we often hear that the industry doesn't feel that they're being consulted adequately. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about other organizations, whether, as well as fishers, harvesters, whether they, where we could improve consultation from your perspective.
Right. So My experience is from the Maritimes, and I have sat in a lot of rooms, a lot of those consultations with a lot of different groups in the room, a lot of different fishing industries, ENGOs, academics that provide the science, all sorts of government. And so I would say that those are heated debates. They always are. I would say that we can always do better. And I think where we can do better is spending time ahead of the process and everybody informing, providing evidence to every other actor in the room about what this would mean. So the scientists can say, this is why you need 30 by 30. The fishing industry can say, well, okay, but if you put it there, this is what it will mean to the industry. And so I think consultations are critical. I think we need to have as many stakeholders and Indigenous people in the room as we can. And I think we should educate one another as much as possible.
Thank you. Information is always power, so educating people is probably one of the best strategies that we can use. Ms. McDonald, I think you talked about there being an insufficient strategy and organizations and departments working in silos. And I think we're seeing a little bit of that when we saw that the provincial government in Newfoundland has now reversed their decision on at least one of the MPAs. And I'm curious to know if you can talk about some of the other provinces across the country. How are they engaging, and are they buying in, or how can we get more buy-in from the provincial governments as well?
So I'm afraid I'm going to have to jump in here because we are over time. I think it's an important question, and Ms. McDonald, if you'd like to respond to that in writing, it would be much appreciated by the committee. Mais avec ça, on va continuer.
So we will now continue with Mr. Deschênes for 6 minutes, please. Thank you, Chair. Good morning to everyone. Thank you for being here. I'd like to start by turning to Ms. Dwan Street. Ms. Street, you've talked about double standards between the prohibitions which flow from setting up these marine protected areas, so standards for the fishing industry, and then another industry standard for the gas and oil companies. Can you explain the situation?
Sure. I'll just use the example of the development in Northeast Marine Slope. And we were consulted fairly heavily and told, there is no fishing activity in that area. And of course, on the coast of Newfoundland and Labrador, we do have a fair amount of oil and gas activity. And our members were willing to make some sacrifices and compromises there with that area because, of course, they did recognize what a rich, vibrant area it was. But then, of course, we find out that there is absolutely no restriction on seismic activity or oil and gas exploration in there. So our members aren't able to drop a single hook to catch a fish in that area. But a seismic vessel can go in and blast all day, all night long. And if there is a finding of oil and gas there, then, they can drill. And that's problematic. We've heard from our members for decades now of the difference that they saw in catchability once a seismic vessel will go through an area. I think about turbot in particular. Our members will tell you that the second a seismic vessel goes next to their vessel while they're fishing turbot, their catch rates drop off to pretty much nothing. So we fail to see how allowing that activity in the refuge is okay. And our members can't even drop a hook, which is a non-destructive, it's not a bottom contact gear, and that's completely prohibited.
Well, that's something new. I thought that in the marine protected areas there would be no oil or gas development, but you're saying that in your sector you've got the Northeast Marine Slope. This is actually happening. So how did you learn that they want to prohibit fishing activities but allow for oil and gas exploration? How did you hear about that?
So it really depends on the categorization of the area that they're trying to close because, you've got marine protected areas, you've got marine refuges, you've got national conservation marine areas, and each one has a certain amount of criteria. So it really depends on the label that they put on the area. And the Northeast Marine Slope is labeled as a refuge. So that means no fishing, but allows oil and gas. And generally, depending on the area, we do have to go to government and say, okay, look, what are we looking at here? Because with the NMCA, of course, that our province just pulled out of, and we're very thankful that they did, we were barely consulted. We asked Parks Canada some questions because, of course, we had not dealt with an NMCA. And we asked what that would allow, what it would permit, what it would restrict. And we were told, oh, well, the fishing industry, the effects on the fishing industry are going to be very minimal. But then we realized that scallop fishing, scallop dragging is completely prohibited. And that's a massive industry down there. I mean, it's small boat harvesters, but it's high value. And we were told absolutely not. And it's like, okay, well, obviously we can't support this. So it really depends on the categorization of the area that they're closing.
So in this case, when did you discover that it would be possible to have gas and oil development in this area?
As soon as we were consulted and we got to the table, and we always ask, what other industries are going to be affected. And when it comes to on the east coast of our province, we always ask, what's going to happen with oil and gas? Are they going to be permitted to still operate? And the answer was absolutely, yeah.
And when you talked about this in the advisory committee and said that it would make sense to prohibit fishery activities but allow for oil and gas exploration activities, how did they react?
They didn't really have answers for us, which is unfortunate. And I was around when that process was ongoing, and I was actually at that point in the industry liaison position here at FFAW. And I mean, we've tried to push as hard as we could, but we were told, no, the fishing industry is the one that's going to be shut out. And again, it always seems like it's the fishing industry that has the target on its back and has to bear the brunt of the sacrifice when parts of our ocean are closed.
So the
Northeast Marine Slope is in which sector? Has it already been set up, established?
Yes, that area has been closed now for quite some time. I'm guessing it was probably around 2016, 2017, maybe, if I recall correctly.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Street. That's quite a cause for concern, what you've just explained. And you've talked about economic losses that you're fearing. Do you already have examples in Newfoundland and Labrador where MPAs that have been set up have led to negative economic losses for the fishery activities?
Absolutely. If I just take the example of the Funk Island Deep, we're seeing it not only economically, but ecologically. It's completely thrown off the ecosystem. And that area was closed to protect northern cod. But now you've got a box where northern cod are just absolutely taking over and diminishing the snow crab resource in that area. So harvesters are losing out in 3K, which, last year in snow crab, they were absolutely devastated with a 50% cut. That was being proposed. We were able to get that down to 25, but it was still a significant loss. And harvesters are saying that area is a problem because the predation of northern cod right now on snow crab in that area is absolutely off the charts. And that's what we're always concerned about. There's a couple other ones. Think about Eastport. That was a harvester-driven initiative, and they're always keeping an eye on it because it's there to protect lobster. And there's always concern that when lobsters are allowed to just grow. The big ones kind of, the predation on the little ones gets a little bit out of hand. So, we're always monitoring those ecological impacts. And when there is an impact like that, then it does affect the harvester's bottom line. It's always the owner-operator that will feel those effects first and foremost.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Deschênes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deschênes.
We're going to start the second round with Mr. Arnold for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the witnesses for appearing today. I want to take us back to the reason for this study and the quotes from the lines from the study motion, where the committee undertake a study on how the Government of Canada has established marine coastal protection since 2015, with a particular focus on how these government initiatives have affected Canadians and the coastal communities that depend on fisheries and marine resources. The government's methods for measuring whether conservation objectives and reasons for establishing protected areas are achieved, and whether the government's reasons and objectives for establishing marine coastal protections are achieved. So I'll start off with Ms. Metaxas, if I could. You mentioned spending time before or ahead of the process to make sure the consultation is done correctly. Could you explain possibly why it is that this committee continuously hears from harvesters and users of the resource that they have not been consulted, or if they were consulted, their input was either ignored or sometimes used against them? Why is that something we hear all the time at this committee?
Okay, so I have no experience the consultation process anywhere other than the Maritimes, obviously. And in my experience, those consultation processes did include the harvesters. Speaking of NGOs, during consultation process, it was my personal experience that a member of an NGO acted as a broker to facilitate moving forward between the fishing industry and government. So I guess the reason you hear it is because, of course, livelihoods are affected. And so whether I think there's also misperceptions about whether the industry is not being listened to, not doing what the industry asks for right off. It's not necessarily not listening to them, but what the industry we absolutely must have, and I agree 100% with Ms. Street, is an assessment of this is what the industry proposes. This is how this would impact the conservation objective. This is how the conservation objective will impact the industry.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I want to move now that you've mentioned that you agree with Ms. Street on something. I'll turn to Ms. Street and ask, are all Canadians equally impacted by marine conservation protection?
In our opinion, absolutely not. Again, it always seems like it is the fishing industry that has to give, and receive nothing in return. And if it's not only the FAW that feels that way. I've spoken with some of my colleagues in the Maritimes, and I'm just thinking about St. Anne's Bank. I mean, they tried to work very, very hard to compromise and come up with an area that they felt could be closed and actually be beneficial to the ecosystem. And they were told, we will work with you and ensure that impacts are minimal. And when the area was finally closed, they lost about 30% their most lucrative halibut fishing area. So, it's easy to see why the fishing industry gets frustrated. And again, when we see oil and gas exploration being able to continue in these areas, and even with this NMCA process that we just went through and our province pulled out of, all we heard about was tourism. And I understand what tourism can bring to an area. I'm from an area that, it was saved by tourism after the moratorium, but you can't sacrifice one industry over another. And what tourists are going to bring for 2 or 3 months of the year, and you're going to take away the livelihood of the citizens of your town. It's not a fair trade-off, and it always seems like it is the fish harvester.
Thank you. Our time is so limited here, unfortunately. Ms. McDonald, I believe it was you that said we can't have growth of marine conservation areas beyond the ability to monitor, and we have insufficient processes. This gets back to one of the key pieces of the study motion was the government's methods of measuring whether conservation objectives are achieved. Has the government put in place the goals and objectives that are needed so that we can monitor to know whether those goals and objectives have been achieved?
So I hate to do this again. We're right at time. So if you could give a brief answer, that would be great.
Yeah, I think what we've seen globally is that the monitoring is not keeping pace with. And so how do we actually leverage consistent monitoring? And I would say, based on what I've heard of the testimony, is that if we're not trusting the outcomes and we're not trusting the recommendations, we're not able to get on the same page, then we are not sufficiently collecting the data to prove out the value from the marine protected areas at this time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Arnold. Next, we're going to go to Mr. Connors for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I'm going to be sharing my time with my colleague, Mr. Morrissey. Ms. Street, are MPAs the best available tool to halt or reverse the losses of marine biodiversity? And if not, from an industry perspective, what would you recommend?
We don't feel that the evidence is there to support that. And again, all we want to see is that what the area is closing the area is supposed to achieve is actually achieved. And with current methods of monitoring and what we've experienced, we feel that none of these areas have really done what they've said they were going to do. Some of the ones that have, I mean, you used Eastport as an example, and Eastport is a good one because Eastport was harvester driven. Harvesters went to government and saw that there could be potential gains by protecting their lobster resource, and they monitor it. You know, they have an Eastport lobster MPA monitoring committee, and I sat on that a few years ago. And you know, they're constantly looking at the area and saying, okay, is what we're doing here actually achieving what we want to? And they keep an eye on it. But when government is coming at us top down and saying we're going to close this area, and we ask what it's going to achieve, and they tell us, and we say, okay, so how do you know this? And they can't give us answers. And then years down the road, we say, okay, what has this achieved? And they still don't have answers. That's the problem. We feel that when an MPA or closure is grassroots led, and that's the folks on the water and those that are in their livelihood from it that see a benefit, potential benefit, and are able to work with government. And, you know, if it doesn't work, then let's reopen it. That's not a problem. It's when it's top down and it's government coming to us and saying, okay, here's what we're going to close, and that's it. We'll consult with you, tick a box, but you really, really have no input here. That's when it becomes problematic.
Thank you. In your experience, have you ever seen the boundaries of an MPA that have changed after it was implemented and had further negative impacts on the industry?
In my experience, I haven't. That's not to say it hasn't happened, but generally, when something is proposed, that's been what's implemented, and there hasn't been much adjustment there.
Okay. So on the consultation piece, currently, how are fishers consulted, and do you think that process could be improved?
Absolutely. I mean, I'll just use the NMCA on the Southwest Coast as an example. We found out about that, and then I kind of had to push our own way in there. The answers we were getting were very wishy-washy. We were trying to set up meetings with harvester committees in the area. They would only offer us meetings conveniently when they knew harvesters were fishing. When we were finally able to get those meetings, they would hold meetings with other stakeholders on the same day. And the only messaging that would be communicated publicly would be the positive messaging out of the other meeting. It was just not a transparent process, not a trustworthy process, and something just really, really didn't feel good.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share with Bobby now, and Mr. Morrissey.
Thank you, Chair. Interesting discussion, but Chair, at this moment, I would like to move the following motion that has been on table, or been tabled last week, and I believe all members should have it in both official languages, correct? So the motion is that the committee recognizes that 1, Atlantic mackerel is a key forage species and source of bait for many fishers in Atlantic Canada and Quebec. 2, mackerel fishing has been affected because DFO science indicates that the species is in the critical zone in Canadian waters. 3, harvesters have witnessed large schools of mackerel while on the water, and videos on social media have shown evidence of large mackerel schools over the last year, raising questions about the health of the stock. 4, the United States is planning to increase its quota for Atlantic mackerel, which could put new strain on Canada's fishery, ecosystem health, and stock rebuilding plans. B, pursuant to Standing Order 1082, 1, the committee conduct a 6-meeting study on Canada's mackerel fishery, the current rebuilding plan for Atlantic mackerel, the science and analysis of mackerel in Canadian waters, the recent U.S. science of mackerel, and the potential impacts that increased U.S. fishing could have on Canada's mackerel stocks. 2, the committee hears from harvesters as well as scientific experts. 3, the committee reports its findings and recommendations to the House. And C, pursuant to Standing Order 109, the committee requests the government to table a comprehensive response to this report. Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Morrissey. So the aforementioned motion has been moved. All members should have that both in their inbox and also in the room here in hard copy as well. So with that, I'll open it up to debate if anybody would like to speak to this. Mr. Arnold.
Could I just ask for a very short recess?
Yes. We'll briefly suspend them. Up, is there any debate on the motion? Monsieur Deschamps?
Oui, merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to suggest an amendment because when it comes to the situation of Atlantic mackerel, that it should be studied, but also the situation with herring, please. Add herring.
Chair, we would agree with the addition of herring to the study.
That addition has been put forward. Is there any other debate on this amendment? Okay, so are we all in agreement to amend the motion accordingly? Agreed. Okay, so now we're back to the motion as amended. Is there any other debate on the motion? Okay, is everybody in favor of the motion? Okay, motion adopted. Okay, looking at the time here, we're going to move on. On va avancer à Monsieur Deschamps.
We'll move on to Mr. Deschamps.
Finish with Mr. Gunn. Monsieur Deschamps, vous avez la parole pour 2 minutes et demie.
You've got 2.5 minutes, Mr. Deschamps. Thank you, Chair. I'd like to come back to the discussion with Ms. Street and talk about the closure of the Northeast Marine Slope. From what I've understood, we've set up a refuge and we've allowed oil and gas exploration to take place currently. And you've been told that, in the Newfoundland fishing industry that it's impossible for you to carry out any fishery in that zone. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Alors, quel effet...
So what is the effect of this type of double standard amongst your members?
Well, it's a very lucrative area. Especially for deep water turbot fishing, we do have a fleet of vessels that will go out there and gill net turbot in those fathoms, and they're just not able to fish there anymore. And while it's not a large part of our fleet, it was a very lucrative fishery at one point.
Parce que c'est un enjeu qui revient souvent sur les...
This issue often comes up, the social license, social acceptability, to be able to consult and get buy-in so that compromises can be struck. So when you see that situation, how does that affect your members' perception of protected marine refuges and whether that's a good policy or not?
Well, again, our members just want to see results. We want to see evidence, and we don't feel that we've been presented with anything to show that our fish stocks, our marine ecosystem is benefiting from any of these areas. We just haven't been provided anything.
Je comprends. Mais sur la fermeture du...
I understand, but with the closure of this slope, the fact that we are saying yes to oil and gas exploration but no to fisheries, how has that been welcomed by your members?
It's not. I mean, we always have concerns with oil and gas activity and specifically seismic. DFO here has done some work on snow crab in particular to see what the effects of seismic have been on the species and, how it drives into different areas and makes them migrate or, it's really concerning. And there's always been concerns or studies done in New Zealand, Australia on the effects of swim bladders of fish when it comes to seismic activity. So we're always really concerned because we know what seismic is. It's a massive blast. It's a noise. And there's no way it doesn't affect a fish.
Et donc, ce qu'on comprend, c'est que le gouvernement...
So the government has chosen the oil and gas industry to the detriment of the fishers.
Yes, that's our perception.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Deschênes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deschênes.
Minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Street, when it comes to conservation, do you believe these mass area closures that have been proposed as part of the government's plan to implement the UN's 30 by 30 are based primarily in science, or are they being pushed by an unscientific or not scientifically proven ideology?
We feel they're political. Again, we feel those targets are political. There doesn't seem to be any scientific evidence that the closure is going to protect anything. And again, for the NMCA, we were told it was largely socioeconomic, that it was going to bring tourism. These towns, I mean, they're not large towns. They don't have a whole lot of money being injected into their economy. And I can see why some of these town councils, when they're told by Parks Canada that there's going to be $100 million injected into their communities, why they would jump on this. But when we asked them where that $100 million was going to come from, they had no answers. And they were promising all these jobs. And we're saying, okay, so where are these jobs going to come from? And they had no answers. So we don't feel like it's evidence-based at all, whether it's economically or scientifically. We feel it's largely political.
Now here in British Columbia, they've started the draft work to create these giant marine protected areas as part of meeting this 30 by 30 target. And certain fisheries like prawns, for example, face the very real possibility of losing up to 40% of their access to key fishing grounds. If something like that happened to the fishermen that you represent, what would that mean for them, their families, their ability to earn a living, to put food on their table, and the coastal communities where they live?
Well, after speaking with some of my colleagues in BC, I know how important prawn is out there, and I'd compare it to, our snow crab fishery. And there are no other economic opportunities in a lot of these communities. And when it comes to our coastal communities, it's the fishery that draws it. It's not uncommon for a harvester's spouse to be working in the processing plant. And we try to drive it home to our politicians all the time that without these rural communities and without the fishing industry, places like St. John's, Gander, Corner Brook, those urban centers, they're not going to flourish either, because that's where our folks are going to go buy their vehicles. They're going to go buy a lot of their groceries. The fishery drives this province. And if you remove any chunk of their income, then, it's absolute devastation, because what's your alternative in a province that the fishery is the backbone?
And just for clarity, do you know, in British Columbia, the process is well underway to meet these kind of arbitrary and, as you put it, political targets. Are they doing something similar on the Atlantic coast? Have they started drafting out and mapping out these mass area closures to meet this 30 by 30 metric?
They have, and I mentioned earlier, we were told about the Virgin Rocks is on the table, and that's a huge concern for us because, of course, fisheries in Newfoundland and Labrador go in cycles, and right now we have a strong shellfish industry, but we also have a recovering groundfish industry. And northern cod right now has grown, the TAC doubled this year, and it's provided a massive economic opportunity to our members. And once shellfish starts to go down, which happens every 7 to 10 years, they're going to rely more on northern cod. And the Virgin Rocks was such a lucrative area when it came to our larger vessels that our members would fish. So, if you take away that area and that opportunity, that's going to be massive. And we're definitely going to push back hard on this one. This just can't happen.
And just really quickly, one final question for you. Does it frustrate you when you see these large, primarily foreign-funded environmental groups that are pushing and advocating for these mass area closures where they really don't have any skin in the game, as it were, as far as they're not going to be the ones that lose their jobs. That they're not based in the coastal communities where the massive economic effects will be felt if the government goes ahead with trying to meet these UN targets.
Absolutely. I mean, we are frustrated to no end. And I know one of the most frustrating parts for us was walking into a herring advisory, and all of a sudden we're looking at Oceania and Oceans North are sitting at the table where the year previous they were observers sitting in the back. And we asked DFO, we say, okay, when did these groups get promoted to stakeholder status? What stake do they hold in our industry? And we're just told, okay, they're at the table now and that's it. So knowing that they have an equal voice with the folks who make their living on the water is deeply, deeply concerning.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gunn. And that's going to complete our first panel today. I want to thank all of our witnesses for taking the time to be with us by video conference and here in person as well. Your testimony is going to be very, very useful as we're putting together recommendations for government flowing from that. But with that, we're going to briefly suspend while we welcome our next panel. Just want to start by making a few comments for the benefit of the new witnesses. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. And for those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you're not speaking.
And for interpretation, for those of you who are on Zoom, at the bottom of your screen you can select either Floor, English or French. And for those of you who are in the room, you can use the earpiece and select your preferred language channel.
Should be addressed through the chair. But with that, I would like to welcome our new witnesses. We have Aaron Height, Operations Manager, Great Bear Sea Marine Protected Areas Network. Also in person, we have Richard Patton, Assistant Executive Director, Marine and Wildlife Conservation, from Kikitani Inuit Association. And by video conference, we have Francis Scairds, the councillor, Kalipu Mi'kmaq First Nation. So with that, we're going to start with witnesses' opening statements for 5 minutes or less, starting with Mr. Height.
Thank you for the opportunity to present. I'm currently the operations manager for the Great Bear Sea MPA network. I've worked in the Northern Shelf Bioregion in marine management and planning for First Nations and federal and provincial governments for 20 years. Over that 20 years, there have been many government policies, directives, and commitments to advance ecosystem-based management, marine spatial planning, and marine protected areas in BC. The MPA network process builds on this existing work. As a planner, one of my roles is listening to the concerns of coastal community members and working with the partners to consider and address them. In that role, I've spent years working in communities on BC's coast. I'm here today to provide information and clarification to the committee regarding MPAs in the region, including the 10-year planning process that resulted in the Network Action Plan. In my opening remarks, I want to clarify 5 points about MPA planning in the region. First, the Network Action Plan was made in Canada, made in BC, and made on the coast. The plan was co-developed and endorsed by 17 First Nations and the governments of Canada and BC, whose economies and cultures are deeply tied to this marine area. Extensive local knowledge from businesses, economic development corporations, and First Nations commercial fishermen and harvesters was incorporated into the plan. The network was built from the ground up, balancing economic, community, and conservation goals. The balanced planning approach is reflected by the endorsement of 17 First Nations, many of which are strong commercial fishing communities. Second, stakeholder engagement in the network planning process was extensive. It included over 60 sessions with stakeholders and involved broad representation across 15 ocean sectors, including commercial and recreational fisheries, aquaculture, tourism, coastal forestry, and municipalities. To be clear, fishing associations expressed concerns about the network. In response to this, significant changes were made between network scenarios. For example, it led to the removal of entire sites from the network, adjustments of boundaries, and modification of conservation objectives. However, the partners also heard from many people, including owner-operators, who are extremely concerned about the health of our ocean and the state of the fisheries. Over 70% of public respondents that live in the Northern Shelf bioregion support the proposed MPA network. The partners were repeatedly asked why they were moving so slowly in establishing MPAs. Third, there is still much work to do with stakeholders before MPAs are established. The Network Action Plan is a blueprint that guides MPA establishment, similar to identifying areas of interest. All proposed MPA sites still need to go through a regulatory process to be established and still require management plans. These processes require stakeholder engagement and socioeconomic assessments. All this work still needs to be done. Fourth, a socioeconomic overview was part of the network design process, and it concluded that network implementation is expected to have many economic and social benefits for those living in the area and beyond. The socioeconomic overview was published with the Network Action Plan and is available on the network website. Direct GDP value of marine sectors in the region was estimated at $1.3 billion. This includes $300 million from aquaculture, $251 million from marine transportation, $112 million from tourism, and $87 million from commercial fishing. The overview estimated that 8% of commercial fisheries landed value in the Northern Shelf bioregion could be affected by the network. Finally, the partners have committed to long-term monitoring of economic, ecological, social, and cultural network outcomes. To this end, a monitoring framework that outlines the collaborative process for developing and doing network monitoring, including stakeholder involvement, was published on the network website in 2024. In conclusion, MPA planning in the Great Bear Sea Northern Shelf bioregion represents a decade of work with 17 First Nations, 15 ocean sectors, and the provincial and federal governments to design a network that will help create social, economic, and ecological resilience and abundance for coastal communities. The regulatory processes required to establish each MPA will further ensure that stakeholders' voices are heard and reflected in MPA establishment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And with that, we'll now go to Mr. Patton for 5 minutes or less.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. On behalf of the Kikitani Inuit Association, often referred to as QIA, I am pleased to respond to questions raised by this committee founded on the understanding of the Inuit to Crown relationship established by Marine and Coastal Protection since 2015 and the impact felt by Inuit since. So the Kikitani region encompasses 10% of Canada's landmass. We are larger than the province of British Columbia, and certainly within our region, there are 20,000 Inuit living in the Kikitani, of which approximately 16,000 are Inuit. Traditional values such as sharing, respect for elders, and cooperation remain central to our community life. QIA, in working with the Government of Canada between late 2016 through to signing in 2019, sought to advance an Inuit-led approach to the management of Tarutu Iminga, or what we refer to as TI, the National Marine Conservation Area surrounding the waters of Lancaster Sound. This included a shift in historical agreements such as the one signed by Canada to open national parks in 1999, in that it added a layer for an all-Inuit committee to recommend changes across the NMCA and required Canada to work with Inuit on the development of an interim management plan. What I can say is since 2022, QIA has been advancing a regional conservation approach embedded in opportunities for Inuit governance, Inuit stewardship and control over new protected conserved areas through an Indigenous protected and conserved areas lens. QIA, along with Canada and philanthropic donors, signed what we call the SENA Agreement in February of 2025. And while we're at the initial stages of developing the IPCA lens embedded within SENA, the Government of Canada lacks support for an inclusion of an IPCA approach under federal legislation. Currently, the only viable pathway to facilitate impact and benefit agreements where Indigenous, in our case Inuit, partners are advancing Canada's commitments under the 2030 by 30 target. Kikitani Inuit have long sought to protect the rights of Inuit with respect to harvesting fisheries, both inshore, as advanced under the Nunavut Agreement, and in the offshore, where waters adjacent to the Kikitani region are captured under Article 15 of the Nunavut Agreement, and where government is meant to recognize the principles of adjacency and economic dependence of communities on marine resources. I would say of particular interest to this committee's questions raised with QIA, Section 16.1.1 of the TI Agreement, which is Lancaster Sound, states as the primary objective to recognize that fishing and the harvest of wildlife is central to Inuit culture and community well-being and may contribute to a conservation economy. So that was the first iteration of conservation outcomes embedded in Articles 8 and 9 of the Nunavut Agreement that sought to understand and support collaboration between the Department of Fisheries and Oceans and Inuit around the potential for sustainable commercial fishery embedded within conservation outcomes. So as we look to discuss the methods for measuring whether conservation objectives and reasons for establishing protected areas are achieved, we should first look to understand how the conservation economy is affirming Inuit jurisdiction and authority while building a broader Inuit economy. Movement towards greater representation of Inuit laws will consolidate and enhance the ability to be self-determining, creating concrete steps towards reconciliation between Inuit and Canada, while broader policy thinking is still evolving around an economy that protects our environment. Kikitani Inuit represent less than 0.005% of the Canadian population, yet the Arctic, our homelands, represent more than 12% of the combined marine and terrestrial conservation targets Canada has, which under the 30 by 30 target represents 40% of that marine conservation target. So in closing, Inuit stewardship of lands and waters and a sustainable economy are vital to meeting conservation goals and maintaining ecosystem integrity throughout the Kikutani region. A successful conservation economy in our region can serve as a blueprint for conservation economies across the world. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Patton. And we're now going to conclude with opening remarks for 5 minutes or less with Francis Scared.
Excuse me. Hello. Thank you to the chair and members of the committee for inviting me here today. My name is Francis Scared, and I serve on the South Coast Fjords Steering Committee representing the Halibu Mi'kmaq First Nation. I'm here to share our nation's perspective on marine and coastal protection and on the proposed South Coast Fjords National Marine Conservation Area. Our nation has over 25,000 members across 67 communities, many of them rural and coastal. For the Mi'kmaq, the ocean is central to who we are. It has fed our families, supported our communities, and carried our knowledge from one generation to the next. Our responsibilities to these waters come from long-standing Mi'kmaq teaching and lived experiences. Halibu First Nation supports marine conservation in keeping with our long stewardship of Newfoundland. Healthy oceans, habitats, and fisheries are essential to our communities. Protecting ecosystems is not a barrier to prosperity. It is the foundation for it. When habitats are sustained, economies are stronger, more resilient, and better able to support sustainable fisheries, tourism, and other ocean-based industries. The South Coast Fjord study area is ecologically rich and culturally significant. Hunting, fishing, and gathering remain vital to the Mi'kmaq identity and way of life. Over 100 archaeological sites demonstrate generations of continuous use and stewardship. Interviews with elders and community members document long-standing practices, from fishing in Lapoil to White Bear Bay, harvesting along the coast and in our rivers, and traveling seasonally between communities. This is continuous use tied to our identity, responsibility, and cultural survival. The National Marine Conservation Area model provides a framework where conservation and sustainable economy can coexist. It brings together Mi'kmaq governments, harvesters, local leaders, and community organizations to guide zoning, management, and long-term decision-making. When communities help shape the rules from the start, ecosystems are protected while stable, sustainable local economies can thrive. The Government of Newfoundland and Labrador's decision to terminate the South Coast Fjords National Marine Conservation Area Feasibility Study MOU is a missed opportunity for true partnership. Industry concerns are important, but bypassing meaningful engagement prevented our perspectives from being heard and prevent solutions from being fully considered. Instead of collaboration and reconciliation, we're met with colonial approaches. Conservation must reflect the reality that people live and work here. The goal is not conservation versus industry. It must be a shared framework guided by clear rules, informed planning, and Indigenous leadership. Rights holders are not just stakeholders. We are longtime stewards of these waters. When Indigenous leadership is present at the decision-making table, conservation is stronger, more credible, and more durable. Article 29 of the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples affirms our right to the conservation and protection of our lands and waters and calls on governments to work with us to achieve it. Conservation must be done in partnership with Indigenous peoples, not without us. Within Halibu First Nation, our people expect both environmental protection and economic opportunity. A well-designed National Marine Conservation Area can bring investment, research and monitoring programs, stewardship roles, tourism growth, and new employment opportunities, particularly for rural economies or communities that often struggle to secure them. When Indigenous voices shape decisions from the outset, conservation and sustainable development can move forward together. In closing, healthy oceans and healthy communities are inseparable. We support marine protection that respects our rights, reflects local realities, and enables sustainable development. With true partnership and shared responsibility, governments can protect marine ecosystems while supporting the livelihoods and cultures of the people who depend on them. We remain committed to work with all parties to find a path forward that respects Indigenous rights and the needs of coastal communities. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and that will conclude our opening remarks. We'll go straight into the first round of questioning, the 6-minute round, starting with Mr. Arnold.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for appearing before the committee. very important pieces of this is how the government is establishing marine conservation areas, how they're monitoring those areas to see if they're actually achieving any results, and the reason if the reasons for establishing them are actually being achieved. Mr. Height, from the title we're provided in the notice of meeting, it says Operations Manager, Great Bear Sea Marine Protected Areas Network. That would lead me to believe that Great Bear Sea Marine Protected the Great Bear Sea Marine Protected Areas Network is established and in place. Is that correct?
No, the Network Protected Area is a plan. So it's similar to developing an area of interest with an Oceans Act MPA. So it identifies areas that would have value for protection, what the conservation objectives for those areas would be. Each of those areas then needs to go through a regulatory process, just like an Oceans Act MPA would be after an area of interest is identified, or similar with a Marine National Wildlife Area.
So you're the operations manager for
the overall network implementation for the network. I'm a planner.
On behalf of who?
On behalf of the 17 partner nations, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, and the Government of BC.
Would this be attached to the Great Bear Sea Initiative
Yes.
title? Okay.
Yes.
And how is the Great Bear Sea Initiatives funded? Where are the resources?
Well, as we move into implementation, the funding is majority coming from the federal government. There's also a significant component coming from the provincial government, and then there are other philanthropic funders that have matched some of that funding.
Okay, thank you. How much of the $200 million that was received by Great Bear Sea Marine Protected Areas Network that you work for, have those $200 million been deployed into operations that you manage?
Yes, there's a small amount that goes towards network implementation and monitoring.
A small amount out of the $200 million?
Yes. Well, it's not divided that way, so the total amount that has been raised so far is $335 million. So there's $200 million from the federal government. That all goes into a conservation fund, and there's a small amount from that conservation fund that supports network implementation. The majority goes towards sustainable economic development within the 17 partner First Nations communities.
Okay. Have some of the funds been invested so that the Great Bear Sea project can benefit from yields of that investment over time?
The funds all sit in trust with Coast Funds. That's a question for them. But yes, my understanding is that they're invested, and it's actually it's the interest off of the trust that goes towards implementation of the network, economic development, and monitoring of individual MPAs.
Okay, so where those dollars from government were invested, could your organization please send to the committee in writing where they were invested and the results?
I can send you contacts within Coast Funds, which is the responsible manager for the investment of the funds.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Patton, in your observations, have objectives for the marine conservation areas been set out?
I would say the objectives for all of the conservation areas across the Kikutani region are being worked on. The one National Marine Conservation Area, which is Turujip Imaga, which was signed in 2019, has an interim management plan that identifies key objectives for Lancaster Sound. But there are a multitude of marine conservation areas still yet to come online, which have objectives embedded within the SENA agreement that we signed last year.
Okay, thank you. And has the planning process involved how those objectives are going to be monitored or measured?
Yeah, so there's key performance indicators that goes into a monitoring and evaluation plan that we are developing over the next 3 years in partnership with Canada and Inuit in all 13 communities.
So they will be able to measure any results of the conservation areas? Is that the plan?
That is correct, yes.
Okay, thank you. I think that's all I have for for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Arnold. Next, we're going to go to Monsieur Cormier pour 6 minutes.
6 minutes, Mr. Cormier. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Just to make sure that I know actually what you're doing, you're a planner, you said, or you're developing these area for a group of organizations. Is that what I'm understanding from what you're doing?
Yes, I mean, the best way to think about it is I coordinate all of the government partners. So there's 17 First Nations within the Great Bear Sea, the province of BC, and then the Government of Canada, represented mostly from the Department of Fisheries and Ocean, but the Ministry of Transport, Environment Canada, and Parks Canada also engage in the process.
Okay, perfect. So look, when it comes to MPAs, like since the beginning of the study, what we heard is sometimes it's the anti-fishing of the MPA. Sometimes it's the anti-environment of those MPAs. And when we look at around those two things, is sometimes is mostly about how, where, and who's going to bear the cost of those, proposed MPA. So what will be the solution to make sure that everybody gets a win-win situation out of these, MPAs that we're trying to put in place now, in your opinion?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Through the planning process, we engaged with 15 ocean sectors to really understand what their interests are, what their concerns around were MPAs, and that dialogue was critical in the final plan. The final plan, again, is a working plan to inform the regulatory process for each MPA's establishment. And so as we move forward, it will be really important through that process to do strong engagement, to do good feasibility assessments, to do good risk assessments, et cetera. And those are required by the regulatory process.
So, but I understand this, but in the mind of a fisherman, for example, like let's say there's an MPA imposed in a certain area, and this MPA, let's say, will ban fishing. Okay, and is that right now I'm not able to go fishing there? This is a loss of revenue for environmental group. It will say, well, you know what? Like in 10 years, there will be more fish in this area. But in the meantime, who do you think should bear the cost of this loss of, financial activity for the fisher?
Well, the goal of the process throughout was to minimize those impacts. And as you can see in the socioeconomic overview, we've reduced that to overall catch impacts at about 8%. So the process was to minimize the impacts as much as possible. And the witness testimony from Grant Dovey and others, they talked about the scenario that they had developed and shared with us. We reduced the overall projected cost of fisheries through that process by 30% as a result of that engagement.
And are the fisheries organization aware of that what we're trying to achieve here?
Yes, I mean, as I said at the beginning, there was over 60 engagement sessions with stakeholders. When they provided us with the scenario that they developed over a year with all of their commercial fishermen, we sat down with them over 6 workshops to work through it, to understand it, and to provide responses on where we were adjusting the network. And when I say we, I mean the 17 First Nations partners, the Government of Canada, and the province of BC, and where they couldn't, the rationale for why that was not possible.
So I'm not sure if you can answer that question also. We had a previous witnesses last time, and I think it was a group that was giving an example about, I think it was a gooey duck fishing, that they were not able to fish in a certain area. Are you aware of that? That, like just going with boots and, like a shovel and just to go fish gooey duck, that they were not entitled to go do this type of fishing? Are you aware of that? And is this true?
So there's only a couple sites within the network that have already been established. I'm not aware of any gooey duck fishery that would exist within that site. There are sites within the network that are proposed where geoduck has been identified as a conflict to the proposed conservation objective. And in most cases, that is because that site is designed to protect overall biodiversity. And I should clarify, the geoduck fishery is a dive fishery that uses very high pressure, so it interrupts the benthic habitat. It's not shovels and people in boots. It's a scuba fishery with high pressure hoses that impacts the benthic. So if you're trying to protect the benthic habitat, a geoduck can have an impact to that.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Patton, just quickly, because I think I have like 30 seconds, you talked about an agreement that you just signed with the federal government in 2025. What is this agreement again, please?
So it is called the SENA agreement. It was signed in February 2025 that will look to conserve a network of marine conservation areas of just under 1 million square kilometers, or what is often referred to as about 100 million hectares across the Kikutani region, embedded in about 6 different areas across the Kikutani region.
Okay, thank you. I think my time is up, Mr. Chair, so thanks for the answer.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Cormier. Et prochainement,
Thank you, Mr. Comey, and now Mr. Deschênes for 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon. Thank you to all the witnesses for being here to shed light on matters with us. So first of all, Mr. Francis Skade from the Kwalipu Mi'kmaq First Nations. The nations that you represent is on the island of Newfoundland. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, sir, but it's not converting to English. I apologize.
D'accord, on va...
Yes. We'll put things on pause for a moment. We'll suspend.
Mr. Skirt, if you could just make sure that you click on the interpretation button. It should be on the bottom of your screen. It's a globe. You should click on that.
Okay, so sorry. It's done now.
Okay. On va recommencer.
So we can start again. Can you hear me, sir? So you can hear me now and you can understand me too, Mr. Skirt? It's working? So you represent the Kwalipu Mi'kmaq First Nation, which is found on the island of Newfoundland. Is that correct?
Correct.
So how has this been perceived in your First Nation when there was the closure of the northeast marine slope that was announced? And they banned all fishing activities, but they allowed oil and gas exploration. How is this perceived?
I can't speak to that except that we fundamentally believe in a balanced approach on economic development and conservation. So I can't speak to that question, sir.
OK. Mais donc, pour vous...
Okay. So for you, is this a balanced approach to ban all fishery activities in a refuge, but to allow oil and gas exploration to take place?
If this was in the National Marine Conservation Area on the south coast of Newfoundland that we've been working on, we would expect that oil and gas prospecting would also be eliminated from comparable areas. So I can't speak to other areas, but I can speak to in our traditional territory. So is that helpful, sir?
Oui, cela, merci. Et pourquoi?
Yes, very helpful. And why would it be important for you to ban all oil and gas prospecting in a refuge, a protected refuge?
In a national marine conservation area, the South Coast Fjords one that we were working on until recently, oil and gas exploration and production was a exempted economic development.
I don't know if I understood. Why is it important to actually exclude oil and gas exploration from these protected areas?
As when we started the process with the National Marine Conservation Area, the South Coast Fjords feasibility study, there were 2 or 3 economic development pathways that wouldn't be allowed to occur. one of which was oil and gas exploration. Another was minerals. Another was use of bottom contact trawling. So not all fishing, bottom contact trawling was an exemption.
Et la question que je vous pose, c'est pourquoi.
So the question I'm asking is, why did they have to exclude oil and gas prospecting?
To basically, if it became a feasible protected area, oil and gas was deemed to be non-conducive to a protected area of this manner.
Monsieur Aaron Aid.
Mr. Aaron Height, you're on the West Coast and you're working on a big MPA. What type of message does this send out, do you think, when it comes to northeast Newfoundland with the northeast marine slope, where we said, look, it's going to be a refuge, but they allowed oil and gas exploration to continue at the same time as banning any fishing activities?
Well, I can say within the Northern Shelf Bioregion, where I work, well, there is a moratorium on oil and gas there, so it doesn't become an issue. However, any federal tools that are used have to follow the federal protection standards, which do ban oil and gas within federal protection tools. So that's the Oceans Act MPA, National Marine Conservation Area Reserves, Marine National Wildlife Areas.
Oui, mais là, c'est arrivé.
But this has actually happened on the northeast marine slope. There is exploration carried out by BP. So what type of message does that send out? Because we're trying to set up MPAs, and do you think this is acceptable?
Well, I think it's hard to make the argument that offshore oil and gas is consistent with conservation objectives, but there's two cases within the framework where that I understand can happen. So marine refuges don't follow the federal protection standards. It's case by case. And then the federal protection standards were established recently, and they're not grandfathered back. So if the MPA was created before the federal protection standards, that could be the rationale as to why.
C'est pour ça que ça se passe maintenant.
So that's why that's happening now. But do you think we should tolerate that type of situation? Or should we come up with a recommendation to the DFO to close down these possibilities? Because there's something that's going against common sense to say that fishers can't go into that zone but still allow oil and gas exploration. Don't you think this is inconsistent?
You'd have to assess it against the conservation objectives. However, it does seem inconsistent. It seems hard to imagine there's conservation objectives that are consistent with offshore oil and gas.
Et donc, est-ce que...
So, do you think that we should propose to the government that they should change the rules so that this is never possible in any case?
I mean, you're putting me in a tricky spot. My role is to represent 17 First Nations, the Government of Canada, and the Government of BC in the Northern Shelf Bioregion, and so that's where my area is focused. Those are the people that I reply to and take the actions from, so I'd rather not say.
No, mais dans votre secteur, ça sera pas possible.
But in your sector, it would actually be possible. Sorry to cut you off, but we've no more time for the moment.
Start the second round of questioning with Mr. Small for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to welcome the witnesses today, especially Mr. Scared, who hails from the riding of Central Newfoundland. So I'll start with you, Mr. Scared. With regards to the South Coast Fjords NMCA, you mentioned community engagement. Did you engage all the communities on the South Coast that would have been affected by the implementation of the NMCA, or just one or two?
First, I'd like to say thank you for your welcoming, sir. It's nice to see you here. The consultation process with municipalities, communities, organizations was quite extensive. To say that we, as the steering committee, move forward, consulted with every community, I wouldn't necessarily be able to say that. I can say that it was quite extensive and even to a point that as we progressed through the process, we were continuously adding other groups, other organizations to the consultation process.
There chance at success in keeping the NMCA process moving on the South Coast if you'd went to the joint mayors of the South Coast and possibly asked them to be a signatory to the MOU in the same fashion as you went to Burgeo?
Your suggestion is well noted, sir. The process, as you well know, in the beginning, started with Parks Canada, Qalipu, Malbukik, and Burgeo as signatories to the MOU. And as the process progressed very quickly, the diversity of consultation was some of the most extensive that I've seen ever, and especially, I can only speak for myself in this, that I offered a number of unique groups to speak to. It was a continuous yes to all of those opportunities and the like. Some of these consultations were virtual, some were face-to-face, some were hybrid. So from a consultation point of view, it was, as I think I've said already, quite extensive. So your point on the joint mayors is very warranted. I can't speak to where the joint mayors group contacted or not.
Yeah. So in the funding that groups receive to help them move messaging forward and to affect public opinion, would any funding that you'd receive over this process have come from American trust funds and foundations such as Pew?
Qalipu First Nation received funding from Parks Canada to move this agenda forward. What other organizations received, I can't speak to, sir. But Qalipu received funding. We had a contribution agreement with Parks Canada to cover our expenses in participation for this process of the feasibility study.
Okay. So in hindsight, do you think that engaging the support of ASF may have been counterproductive to your cause when you look back on at it?
What I would suggest is that there's a number of things that were counterproductive to the process. I will say that engagement with at a much more robust piece with any and all industry groups was a very piece in saying. So we attempted to have early and robust consultation with some groups, and they were just less available than I would have expected. So it's, to me, it's more, that's the missing piece that I wish we would have had a much more engagement on with the industry groups, sir.
So no doubt there will be more endeavours to create a national marine conservation area on the South Coast. If that should come, if it should begin, the process begin again, would you be acceptable to ocean wind farms operating within a national marine conservation area, or would you want them exempted as you would oil and gas?
So we're over time here. If you could just give a brief answer.
It's important.
I think while it's important, sir, I represent on this process. I represent Council, Qalipu First Nation Council. Qalipu First Nation Council does not currently have a position on offshore wind farms, so I can't, with the greatest of respect to your question, sir, and with greatest respect to the need. And I will say this: that in previous councils, we had representation on offshore wind farm, environmental assessment process, regional assessment, things of this nature. So we are in the pathway to make decisions on these things. Sometimes we make the decisions, and sometimes we pause whatever suits the needs of our membership.
Thank you very much, Mr. Small. Next, we're going to go to Mr. Connors for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and welcome to all the participants. I want a couple of questions to the Halibu First Nation. You said it was extensive consultation. Was that government-led or partnership-led, industry-led?
The consultation was predominantly led by the steering committee. So to a large extent, the steering committee had a couple of staff members provided by Parks Canada. So a lot of those individuals were the ones that led the consultation. A lot of those people were the ones that went into communities and things of this nature. But the entire steering committee was offered the opportunity to participate as much as we can. And so like myself, most of the virtual ones I participated in, a lot of the physical ones, it was just some challenging times of the year weather-wise and things of this nature. So predominantly, the consultation was led by the steering committee.
Okay, and do you know if the consultations included like fishers, commercial fishery?
Absolutely, yes, sir. Absolutely, yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir, it did.
Is the Halibu First Nation involved in commercial fishery?
I guess without taking too much time, Halibu First Nation has a development corporation. The development corporation has one shareholder, which is Halibu. The development corporation itself is involved in commercial fisheries. So I guess the answer to that is yes.
So I think in your opening remarks you mentioned that you saw benefits your First Nation saw benefits from the MNCA. Was there any socio-economic analysis done, or was that looked at in any way?
We were in the process of doing those types of things. It's socioeconomic analysis, as you well know, is a fairly time-consuming process. It was something that was in the process of being looked at from the diversity of the things. In saying so, there were certain data sets that were being able to use to show that things such as if Sandbanks Provincial Park was converted into a national park, what economic drivers that would cause if there was more tourism activities ongoing in the area, what would that result in? So it appeared to be significant financial benefits to Halibu First Nation members, their communities, the other communities in the area from a socioeconomic point of view.
So from a socioeconomic point of view too, was it looked at what negative impacts would be on the fishing industry or the aquaculture industry?
It would be in the same context, sir. But I do think that there seems to be a bit of misunderstanding from the negative impacts on the fishing. While there would be some in the sense of some special interest areas and zonals, it wasn't significant. Like in the context of the earliest mapping, the draft area was just shy. Well, basically, we reduced it based upon concerns raised by the aquaculture sector by about a quarter. We delineated any active agriculture areas. The one and only issue that was to be dealt with through zoning and through more intense negotiations with fishers was the issue on bottom trawling, predominantly for a small scallop business.
Thank you very much.
You remember. Okay.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to take this to introduce a notice of motion.
Okay. Please go ahead.
That small craft harbors are an essential infrastructure for a robust and successful fishery. Safe, well-maintained small craft harbors assist in fishery operations and improving safety for harvesters, local community members, and individuals who work around the water. There are concerns from communities and harvesters that funding processes and designs for small craft harbors needs to be streamlined and improved. The new government was elected to cut red tape and remove barriers for industry so that we can grow one strong Canadian economy. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 B, the committee undertake a 6-meeting study on small craft harbour, on the small craft harbour program, its funding and implementation, the capacity of harbour authorities in managing and delivering small-scale upgrades, and improvements that can be made to remove red tape and streamline the program. Pursuant to Standing Order 109, the committee asked that the government provide a comprehensive response to its report. And I can table that in both French and English as well.
Thank you very much, Mr. Connors. If you can circulate that to the members through the chair, that would be, or the clerk, that would be much appreciated. Okay. Of course, this is just giving notice. This is just giving notice. You'll need to give 48 hours notice before it can be moved, unless it's in committee business, of course. Okay. So with that, we're going to move on to Monsieur Deschênes pour 2 minutes et demie.
2.5 minutes. Thank you. I would also like to give notice of a motion. I'm very happy to do this because it's a subject that often comes up in Gaspésie, and particularly in the Baie des Chaleurs. And so the committee undertake a study in the management of recreational and traditional clam fishing or arenaria in the Gulf of St. Lawrence and Chaleur Bay within a maximum period of 6 months. And the study specifically addressed the opening of new shellfish harvesting areas in the Baie des Chaleurs region and elsewhere in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Also, public support for the opening of new sites, changes in federal resources allocated to recreational and traditional clam fishing since 1980, so on the operation of the Canadian Shellfish Sanitation Program, the CSSP, and the study aims to identify concrete solutions to increase the number of locations open to recreational and traditional harvesting while ensuring public health and the sustainability of the resource, in particular through reinvestment in testing programs and improved collaboration with local communities, Indigenous peoples and municipalities. The committee invites representatives from the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, the Department of Fisheries and Environment Canada, clam fishermen, representatives of the Mi'kmaq Nation, as well as biologists and other environmental experts working for research centres to appear before it. Thank you very much, Mr. Deschênes. So this motion has been circulated to the members. So as I said with Mr. O'Connor's, that's the notice of motion, and for this to progress, there needs to be notice given 2 days beforehand or be presented in camera. So you've got about a minute left to put a question as well. Thank you, Chair. I have a question for Mr. Richard Payton. Currently, how would you describe consultations with you in the federal government to set up MPAs? How are the consultations going?
Thank you. So over the last 3 years, we've engaged all 13 of our communities and have developed a Kikutani Inuit Protected and Conserved Areas Plan. As a part of that process, we have worked with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans to engage communities in the high Arctic. That was facilitated through conversations and engagement on the ground over the last 2 years, with a commitment through our new agreement called SENA to engage all 13 communities with our federal partners. I would say that that goes hand in hand in terms of conservation outcomes across the Kikutani.
Sorry, unfortunately, we'll now go to Mr. Gunn.
Conclude for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Hyde, am I pronouncing that correctly?
It's Height.
Height? Okay, yeah. Mr. Height. You mentioned that 17 First Nations have signed up to support the plan, among whom you're here to represent. Have other First Nations opposed it?
To my understanding, there's a couple nations on the coast that did not support it, and the partners respected that by not doing any planning within their traditional territories.
And why did they oppose it?
I don't engage with non-partner nations. That's the job of the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, so I can't say.
But were you not engaged in consultations throughout this entire area? So you're telling me that you don't know why is speculation on why different First Nations opposed it?
Sure. I mean, I could speculate for sure. You'd like me to?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like they've said publicly why they opposed it, but.
Yeah, the Lakwalams Nation is a commercial fishing nation and is concerned about the commercial fishing impacts. At the same time, the Haida Nation, the Metlakatla Nation, the Heiltsuk Nation are very strong commercial fishing nations, and they have all endorsed the plan. So
I want to clarify something that hasn't been clarified by anybody yet at this committee. The proposed area closures are intended, I'm trying to be as generous to your position as possible. They're intended to eliminate fishing activity that may be disruptive to certain ecological features that the plan and closures are purported to protect. Is that correct?
Correct.
Do you know that in the proposed protected areas and closures, is FSC fishing still permitted?
What the plan states is that Canada has a legal obligation to First Nations under Section 35, and that Canada and that individual First Nation will undergo an assessment to whether FSC occurs. So there are examples within the network where FSC is prohibited, so Hoya Sill, for example, as well as the sponge reefs in the Hecate Strait. And there are examples where FSC does still occur within MPAs like Waihonas.
So there are area closures that exist now. Obviously, as you pointed out earlier, the vast majority of these proposed closures in the Northern Shelf bioregion haven't come into effect yet. So
correct.
We're mainly talking about ones that have already been put into place. But there are closures that have shut out commercial and recreational fishing, but where FSC fishing is still allowed.
Within the network itself, like as a result
on
of
the coast
network
of
planning
BC,
processes?
I know talking to everybody that's been involved in this process, the expectation is that in the vast majority of cases, commercial fishing is going to be shut out and FSC fishing is still going to be allowed. And my point is does that not defeat the entire purpose and basically just turn these into race-based closures?
Well, I would say two things to it. That MPAs do not equal fisheries closures. It aligns with the conservation objective. In some cases, the proposal is that the fisheries close. In addition to that, Canada has
the whole point of them is fisheries closures. Like that's
No.
then what? Then they're just lines on the map.
There are 15 in ocean sectors within BC. All of those sectors have impacts on the ecosystems in the area. We assess those impacts against the conservation objectives. This is way bigger than fisheries. As I stated in my opening statement, commercial fisheries is one industry among many within the Northern Shelf bioregion.
Right. It's the main industry that's making a living on the water.
Marine transportation, marine tourism, marine aquaculture are all by GDP much larger in BC.
Okay. Well, let's move on from that point. Did these 17? You mentioned that you received $200 million from the federal government, but that was only part of your funding. Where did the other funding come from?
So there's $60 million from the province of BC, and then I believe there's something like an additional $45 million from philanthropic organizations.
Can you name the organizations?
I can't. I can provide you with contacts within Coast Funds. They manage the trust. It is modeled after the Great Bear Rainforest Trust, which has created hundreds of businesses and thousands of jobs within the Great Bear Sea and Great Bear Rainforest.
Did the First Nations, the 17 First Nations that you mentioned that signed up to support the plan, were they given any capacity funding to be a part of it?
I believe they all had grants and contributions agreements with DFO. Beyond that, I can't say. That's not my role.
Okay. Do you think that's problematic for groups to basically being paid by the federal government to support a plan being put forward by the federal government?
That's not the way I saw it unfold over 10 years. In fact, I would make the argument that it was the 17 First Nations that were pushing the Department of Fisheries and Oceans towards conservation because of their concern around oceans' health in their territories.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gunn. That ends our time for this panel. I do want to thank our witnesses very much for their time, for being here in person and traveling a long distance or participating by video conference. Your testimony is going to be very, very helpful as we formulate recommendations flowing from this study. But with that, we're going to briefly suspend in order to move to the last part of the meeting, which is going to be in camera. So members of the public and witnesses are going to have to leave the room before we start that. So I'm going to briefly suspend.
Thank you.